My beloved child. Do not turn away from this moment too quickly, because there is a question your heart has carried through nights you never spoke about. What happened inside them when your name appeared again, and why did the tears come only after the door had already begun to close? You have wondered whether your absence meant anything. You have questioned whether the silence touched them at all, whether the memories returned when the room grew quiet, whether the love you gave was remembered or simply buried beneath pride, distraction, and unfinished words. You saw no proof. You received no explanation. All you had was the ache of not knowing. But in this fictional story of reflection and hope, something unfolded in a quiet place where no one was watching. Your name appeared. Their expression changed. Their hands stopped moving. And before they could hide from what they felt, tears filled their eyes. Yet the tears were not the deepest part of what happened. The deepest part was what they finally understood when they saw your name, and why that realization arrived at the one moment when regret could no longer rewrite everything. You need to hear this carefully. Not because you should return to unhealthy waiting. Not because another person's sadness determines your worth. Not because tears automatically mean change. You need to hear it because you have spent too long measuring your value by the silence of someone who did not know how to hold what you offered. Your heart has been asking the wrong question. You kept asking, why was I not enough? But the real question was never whether you were enough. The real question was why they could not recognize something precious until they could no longer reach for it in the same way. There were nights when you replayed conversations in your mind, searching every sentence for the moment everything shifted. You remembered the warmth before the distance. You remembered how easily laughter once filled the space between you. You remembered promises that were never formally spoken but still felt real because of the way they looked at you, the way they lingered, the way their voice softened when the world was not listening. Then something changed. Messages became shorter. Answers took longer. Affection became uncertain. The connection that once felt natural became a place where you had to guess. You began reading silence like a language. You studied pauses. You noticed changes in tone. You carried the emotional weight of conversations that they avoided. You tried to remain patient because you believed love sometimes requires patience. You tried to remain understanding because you knew everyone carries unseen battles. You told yourself not to take everything personally. But each time you excused what hurt you, a quiet part of you became more exhausted. You were not asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. You were not demanding constant attention. You were asking not to feel disposable. You were not trying to control their life. You were trying to understand whether there was still a place for you in it. And when clarity did not come, you did what wounded hearts often do, you blamed yourself for the confusion someone else refused to explain. You wondered whether you spoke too much or not enough. Whether you cared too deeply. Whether you should have been colder, quieter, harder to reach. You wondered whether your tenderness made you easy to take for granted. You questioned the very qualities that once made your love beautiful. But heaven, in this symbolic story, did not look at your tenderness and call it weakness. Heaven saw courage. It saw how many times you chose grace when anger would have been easier. It saw the messages you deleted because you did not want to speak from pain. It saw the nights you placed the phone beside you and promised yourself you would not reach out again, only to feel your heart ache at the thought of becoming strangers. It saw the prayers that were not really requests for reunion. They were requests for peace. Help me understand. Help me stop hurting. Help me know whether I should stay or let go. Those were the prayers beneath the prayers. You may have asked for them, but what you truly needed was freedom from uncertainty. And slowly, without dramatic signs or sudden announcements, something inside you began to change. At first, the change looked like exhaustion. You stopped explaining yourself so many times. You stopped trying to turn their silence into reassurance. You stopped searching for hidden meanings in every small action. You still cared, but you became tired of abandoning yourself just to preserve the possibility of being chosen. That was the beginning. Not the end of love. The beginning of dignity. There is a difference. Love can remain in the heart while the feet begin to walk away from what keeps wounding it. Compassion can exist without access. Forgiveness can happen without reopening every door. You can wish someone healing without volunteering to become the place where their unhealed patterns continue. This was the lesson your pain was slowly teaching you. But they did not see it happening. They believed your patience had no limit. They confused your repeated understanding with permanent availability. They thought the tenderness in your heart meant you would always return, always answer, always leave the light on no matter how long they remained outside. They did not understand that gentle people reach turning points too. Quiet people make final decisions. Loving hearts can close a door without hatred. And one day, something in you became still. Not cold. Still. The difference matters. Coldness wants punishment. Stillness wants peace. Coldness hopes the other person suffers. Stillness no longer needs them to understand. Coldness speaks loudly to prove it is finished. Stillness simply stops returning to the place where it was repeatedly broken. You reached that stillness after a moment no one else witnessed. Perhaps it was an ordinary evening in the imagined world of this story. Rain brushed against the window. A dim light rested across the room. Your phone lay near your hand, silent as it had been so many times before. You considered sending one more message. Not a dramatic message. Not an angry one. Just something small enough to reopen the connection. You knew exactly what you could say. You could ask how they were. You could mention a memory. You could pretend you were not hurt. You could offer them another easy path back into your life without requiring them to face what they had done. Your fingers moved toward the phone. Then stopped. Because a realization rose inside you with painful clarity. Every time you made it easy for them to return without changing, you taught them that your pain had no consequence. You pulled your hand away. That small movement changed the direction of everything. There was no thunder. No visible angel. No voice filling the room. Only a wounded person choosing not to reopen the same wound. But heaven often honors decisions that look ordinary from the outside. That night, you did not chase. You did not write. You did not ask for another explanation. You allowed the silence to remain where they had placed it. And for the first time, the silence began speaking to them instead of punishing you. They did not notice immediately. At first, they assumed you needed time. Then they assumed you were upset. Then they assumed you would return when the emotion passed. They went about their days with a strange confidence built on your history. You had come back before. You had forgiven before. You had looked beyond their fear before. They thought your heart would follow the same pattern. But days changed shape. Your name did not appear. Your message did not arrive. The emotional doorway they had taken for granted remained closed. That is when small things began to disturb them. A song they once sent you played unexpectedly. A place associated with you looked different without the possibility of telling you about it. A phrase you used came from someone else's mouth, and for a split second they turned as though you were near. Memory does not always knock politely. Sometimes it enters through sound. Sometimes through a scent. Sometimes through an ordinary evening that suddenly feels too empty. They began remembering details they had overlooked when you were still accessible. The way you noticed when their energy changed. The way you remembered things they mentioned only once. The way you offered comfort without making them feel weak. The way your presence softened rooms that felt heavy before you entered. At the time, these things seemed natural to them. They did not understand the cost of your care because you gave it with such grace. Now the absence revealed the value. Your silence did not invent your worth. It exposed what had always been there. This is where the hidden conflict began. Part of them wanted to reach out. Another part resisted. Pride whispered that too much time had passed. Fear warned that you might not answer. Shame reminded them that contacting you would require honesty. And honesty was the place they had avoided from the beginning. It was easier to miss you privately than to admit they had mishandled you publicly. It was easier to scroll through old memories than to acknowledge the choices that created the distance. It was easier to tell themselves that life had simply moved on than to face the possibility that they had pushed away someone who had tried to love them without games. But private truth grows louder in quiet rooms. One night, well after midnight, they sat alone. The world had become still. The distractions that protected them during the day were gone. No laughter from other rooms. No work demanding attention. No conversations to hide inside. Only the sound of rain against glass. Only the pale glow of a screen. Only the memory of you. They opened something they had avoided for a long time. Perhaps it was an old conversation. Perhaps a photograph. Perhaps a saved voice message they had never deleted. The exact object matters less than what it carried, evidence of a version of themselves that existed when they still believed you would remain. They scrolled slowly. At first, their face was controlled. Then they saw the kindness in your old words. Not desperation. Kindness. They saw how often you had tried to understand instead of accuse. They saw moments where you offered them opportunities to tell the truth. They saw questions they answered carelessly. They saw warmth they responded to with distance. One message made them pause. It was not the most romantic message. It was not a confession. It was simple. You had written something that revealed you were willing to meet them halfway, but not carry the entire connection alone. At the time, they read it quickly. That night, they understood it. There are words the heart cannot comprehend until consequences give them meaning. They read it again. Then again. The room felt smaller. Their breathing changed. And suddenly, they were no longer remembering only what you gave. They were remembering what they did with it. That is when regret entered. Not the shallow regret of loneliness. Not the regret that comes from missing attention. Something deeper. They began to understand that you had not disappeared without warning. You had been leaving slowly in every moment they dismissed your needs, every time they chose ambiguity over truth, every time they watched you carry the relationship while pretending not to notice the weight. Your final silence had been built from many unheard conversations. They finally saw that. But the tears had not come yet. Not fully. Because one more detail remained hidden. A detail connected to your name. Before that moment arrived, their mind fought back. It reminded them of your mistakes. It replayed disagreements where they felt misunderstood. It searched for reasons to divide responsibility evenly so the guilt would feel lighter. This is what frightened hearts do. They bargain with truth. They do not always lie completely, they simply rearrange the story until accountability becomes less painful. Yes, you were imperfect. There were moments when pain shaped your tone. There were times you withdrew because you were afraid of being rejected again. There were times your need for clarity felt intense because uncertainty had already exhausted you. You were human. But imperfection was never the whole explanation. The deeper truth was that you kept trying to repair what they kept refusing to name. And somewhere within them, they knew it. The screen dimmed. They touched it to bring the light back. Your words returned. A strange heaviness formed in their chest. They wanted to send a message then. They opened the place where your name had once been familiar. Their thumb hovered near the space where they could begin typing. But they did not write. Instead, they closed it. Fear won again. This might sound like the end of the moment, but it was only the first crack. Because once truth enters, avoidance becomes more difficult. The next morning, the room looked ordinary. Light moved across the floor. The rain had passed. Life resumed its usual noise. Yet something inside them had shifted. They carried you through the day. Not as a romantic fantasy. As a question. Did I wait too long? That question followed them. It sat beside them during conversations. It interrupted laughter. It appeared while they drove through familiar streets. It returned whenever the phone remained silent. They began to notice that your absence was no longer temporary. You were not trying to teach them a lesson. You were healing. That frightened them more than anger would have. Anger remains attached. Anger still wants a response. Anger can become another form of connection. But healing moves forward. Healing stops asking the person who caused the wound to become the medicine. Healing builds a life beyond the explanation it once needed. Somewhere, without them seeing it, you had begun returning to yourself. You were sleeping a little more peacefully. You were learning to let a day pass without checking whether they had reached out. You were remembering who you had been before confusion became part of your routine. Perhaps you laughed genuinely one afternoon and realized you had not thought about them for several hours. The realization surprised you. Then guilt entered. How strange that wounded hearts sometimes feel guilty for healing. A part of you wondered whether moving forward meant the love had not been real. You feared that releasing the pain might also erase the meaning. But healing does not deny love. It simply refuses to let love remain a prison. You were not forgetting. You were becoming whole enough to remember without collapsing. And this transformation created an invisible distance greater than miles. They could sense it. Not through supernatural knowledge, but through the changed reality of your choices. Your patterns were no longer available to comfort their uncertainty. Your energy was no longer circling the same unanswered door. They began checking for signs of you. Not obsessively at first. Just occasionally. They looked to see whether you had shared anything. They reread conversations. They wondered whether you had met someone new, whether your life had become lighter, whether your smile had returned in spaces where they were no longer present. The thought of you being happy should have brought peace. Instead, it exposed something difficult. They had wanted the freedom to remain uncertain while still believing you were emotionally waiting. They wanted distance without loss. They wanted time without consequence. They wanted your heart to remain where they left it. But hearts are living things. They change when they are not cared for. Not always by becoming bitter. Sometimes by becoming wiser. This is the point where the story deepens, because their regret was not only about losing access to you. They began realizing they had misunderstood your silence. They once thought your silence meant you had stopped caring. Now they wondered whether it meant you had cared so deeply that leaving became the only way to survive with your dignity intact. That possibility broke something open. They remembered the last serious conversation between you. Not every word, but the feeling. You had been calmer than usual. They mistook your calmness for acceptance. They did not recognize it as farewell. You were no longer trying to win the argument. You were trying to understand whether anything could still be saved. You gave them space to speak honestly. They gave you fragments. You waited for truth. They offered avoidance. And somewhere inside that conversation, your heart received an answer they never said aloud. You realized that love cannot be built on potential alone. You could not keep loving who they might become while being wounded by who they repeatedly chose to be. So you stepped back. Not to make them chase. Not to create a dramatic reunion. You stepped back because you finally understood that choosing yourself was not betrayal. It was stewardship. Your heart had been entrusted to you too. You were allowed to protect it. Days later, in the imagined unfolding of this story, something unexpected happened. Someone mentioned you. It was casual. Your name entered a conversation without warning. No one knew the emotional storm it would create. Perhaps they were sitting with a friend who remembered you. Perhaps someone asked whether you still spoke. Perhaps your name appeared on a screen attached to an old memory, a shared contact, or a passing notification. However it happened, the effect was immediate. They froze. The room continued around them, but they heard almost nothing after your name. One simple sound carried months of avoidance into the present. Your name was no longer just your name. It had become a doorway. Behind it stood every moment they had refused to examine. Behind it stood your laughter. Your disappointment. Your patience. Your last calm goodbye. Their throat tightened. They looked away, hoping no one would notice. But the friend noticed. "Are you okay?" They said yes too quickly. That answer revealed everything. They tried to change the subject. They reached for a glass. Their hand trembled slightly. A wave of memory moved through them, stronger than before. Because this time your name was not safely contained inside an old private conversation. It had entered the real world. It reminded them that you existed beyond their memory. You had a life continuing without them. You could be spoken of by others. Seen by others. Loved by others. And perhaps, for the first time, they understood that losing you did not mean you had vanished. It meant they no longer had the same place in your world. That is when their eyes began to shine. They held the tears back. At least for a moment. But the person beside them said something they were not prepared to hear. It was not cruel. It was not dramatic. It was a simple observation. You really cared about them, didn't you? The question removed every hiding place. They could no longer pretend the connection had been insignificant. They could no longer reduce you to a passing chapter. They could no longer act as though silence had erased what was real. Their face changed. And the truth escaped before pride could stop it. More than they knew. Those words hung in the air. More than you knew. But love that remains unexpressed can still become a wound. Feeling deeply does not excuse acting carelessly. Hidden affection does not repair visible neglect. They understood that too. The friend asked why they had let the connection end. They had no answer that sounded honest enough. Timing? Fear? Confusion? They could have named a dozen reasons, but beneath them all was one truth: they believed they had more time. They believed they could delay clarity. They believed they could return when they felt ready. They believed your heart would remain in the same place. That assumption became the source of the tears. Not because you had punished them. Because time had revealed what comfort concealed. They had taken your presence as evidence that you would always be there. Now your absence proved that love can be real and still reach a boundary. Their eyes filled. They looked down. The first tear fell quietly. No dramatic collapse. No loud confession. Just a tear landing where no one expected it. Then another. They saw your name again on the screen nearby. And something inside them gave way. They cried because they remembered how safe your presence once felt. They cried because they finally understood the courage it took for you to keep showing up. They cried because they knew you had asked for so little compared to what you gave. They cried because your absence had become more honest than the explanations they had offered. But most of all, they cried because a terrible possibility entered their heart. What if you no longer needed the apology they had been postponing? There it was. The fear beneath every other fear. They had always imagined that one day they would explain. One day they would become brave enough. One day they would tell you the truth about what frightened them, why they withdrew, why your love exposed parts of them they were not ready to face. They thought the confession would wait for them. Now they realized you might have already healed beyond the version of yourself that needed it. Too late does not always mean the calendar has closed every possibility. Sometimes it means the old opportunity is gone. The version of you who would have accepted crumbs as proof of love was disappearing. The version of you who would have mistaken regret for transformation was becoming wiser. The version of you who would have immediately answered any message because hope overruled discernment was learning to pause. They could still speak. But they could no longer assume access. They could still apologize. But an apology would no longer guarantee restoration. They could still tell the truth. But truth offered late must accept that it may bring closure rather than reunion. This was what "too late" meant in the chamber of their heart. It meant the power had shifted. Not into revenge. Into reality. You were no longer waiting for them to decide your value. You had begun deciding how you deserved to be treated. Their tears deepened. The friend remained quiet, sensing that this was not a moment to fill with advice. After a long silence, they said something unexpected. I thought they would always come back. The sentence sounded almost childlike. Not entitled in that moment. Afraid. They were finally hearing their own assumption spoken aloud. The friend answered gently, maybe they kept coming back because they loved you. That doesn't mean they were supposed to keep getting hurt. Those words struck harder than accusation. Because truth spoken gently often reaches where blame cannot. They closed their eyes. A memory returned. You standing emotionally before them, trying one final time to explain that you could not continue in uncertainty. They remembered your voice. They remembered the sadness you tried to hide. They remembered how you paused, giving them a chance to say the one thing that might have changed the direction of that moment. They had felt the words inside them. They had wanted to say them. But fear sealed their mouth. You waited. Then you nodded. That nod haunted them now. It was the moment you accepted what they were unwilling to say. Not that they felt nothing. That they were not ready to love you with courage. There is a painful difference. And sometimes, the one who walks away never learns it. You may have believed they did not care. Perhaps believing that was easier than carrying the confusion of someone who cared but still failed you. Yet hidden feeling does not erase the impact of hiddenness. Love must eventually become action, honesty, presence, and responsibility. Otherwise, the person receiving only silence has no safe place to stand. They saw this now. The friend asked whether they had ever told you how much you meant. They shook their head. Not fully. Fragments, perhaps. Signals. Half-confessions. Moments of closeness followed by retreat. Enough to keep hope alive. Not enough to build security. They had given you clues when you needed clarity. And now the clues looked painfully small. The friend said, "Then maybe that is what you are grieving." Not only that they left, but that they left without ever knowing the whole truth. The room went silent again. That sentence changed the meaning of the tears. They were not only mourning you. They were mourning the version of themselves that had been too afraid to be known. You had not rejected their truth. They had withheld it. You had not turned away from their vulnerability. They had hidden behind distance before vulnerability could be tested. They had spent so long protecting themselves from possible pain that they created the exact loss they feared. And your name became the mirror that showed them. Meanwhile, far from that moment, your own healing continued. You did not know they had cried. You did not know your name had opened a flood of regret. And perhaps it was merciful that you did not know. Because your healing could no longer depend on invisible scenes you might never witness. You were learning to trust what was present, not what might be happening in someone else's heart. This is an important truth for you. Another person may miss you deeply and still not be ready to treat you well. They may regret losing you and still lack the courage to repair what they damaged. They may cry over your name and still need to face patterns that tears alone cannot change. Emotion is meaningful. But emotion is not transformation. Regret can open a door. Only accountability walks through it. You were beginning to understand this without becoming cruel. You did not need to deny the connection. You did not need to call every memory false. Some moments had been real. Some affection had been genuine. Some promises were sincere when spoken, even if the person lacked the maturity to fulfill them. Healing allowed you to hold a complex truth: they may have cared, and they still hurt you. Both could be true. You could forgive without pretending the damage did not matter. You could remember the good without returning to the same confusion. You could wish them growth while continuing your own. That is strength. Not hardness. Not indifference. Strength. But the story had not reached its deepest turn. Because after the tears, they made a decision. At first, it was only an impulse. They wanted to contact you. They reached for their phone again. This time, they opened the conversation. Your name rested at the top. The old messages were still there, a record of two people who had once stood near something beautiful and did not know how fragile it was. They began typing. I saw your name today. They stared at the sentence. Deleted it. They tried again. I know it has been a long time. Deleted. Again. I owe you an apology. They left that sentence on the screen. Their heart pounded. For months, they had imagined that contact would bring relief. But now the possibility felt heavier than silence. Because once they reached out, they would lose control of the outcome. You might respond warmly. You might respond politely. You might not respond at all. You might tell them you had forgiven them but moved on. You might ask why they waited until now. Every possible answer required them to face reality. They set the phone down. Then picked it up again. The friend watched without speaking. Finally, they asked, "What are you afraid of?" They answered honestly. That I'll tell them everything, and it won't matter anymore. The friend said, "It may still matter. It just may not change what you want it to change." That distinction entered their heart like a blade wrapped in mercy. Truth can matter even when it does not restore the past. An apology can honor someone even if it does not reopen a relationship. A confession can bring clarity even if it arrives after the person has stopped waiting. Love is not only proven by receiving what you want. Sometimes it is proven by telling the truth without demanding a reward. They looked again at your name. Another tear fell. Then something on the screen caught their attention. A small detail. A date. The last message you had sent before the silence became permanent. They opened it. They had read it many times, but this time they noticed something they had missed. Your words were gentle. Almost too gentle for how much you were hurting. You had not accused them. You had not begged. You had written that you hoped they found the courage to face what they were running from, even if that courage came after you were no longer near enough to witness it. At the time, they thought you were being emotional. Now the sentence felt prophetic, not as a prediction, but as a mirror. The courage had come. You were no longer near. They covered their mouth. The tears became impossible to hide. Your final message had not been an attempt to control them. It had been a blessing spoken by someone leaving with a broken heart. You had wished them healing while accepting that you could not be destroyed waiting for it. They understood the dignity of that now. And for the first time, they saw the full emotional cost of loving them. You had loved someone who kept 1 foot near you and 1 foot near escape. You had tried to create safety with someone who treated vulnerability like danger. You had offered patience to a person who used time as a hiding place. Yet even in leaving, you had not tried to wound them. Your absence was not revenge. It was rescue. Your rescue. That realization brought the deepest tears. They were crying because they had once believed you left too easily. Now they saw how long you had stayed. They were crying because they had called you sensitive when you were actually perceptive. You had felt the distance before they admitted it. You had named the confusion before they were ready to face it. You had sensed the ending while they were still pretending there was no problem. They were crying because they finally understood that your last request had not been impossible. You wanted honesty. That was all. Not certainty about the future. Not perfect love. Not a promise that pain would never come. Honesty. And they had denied you even that because honesty would have required them to confront themselves. The room after midnight returned to their memory. The first time they almost reached out. The many times they chose fear. Each delayed moment now stood around them like unopened doors. They began counting opportunities they had wasted. The day you asked whether something had changed. The night you said you felt alone even when speaking to them. The moment you admitted you were tired of guessing. The final conversation where your voice became calm. They could see it now. You had not vanished suddenly. You had offered them many entrances into the truth. They had refused each one. And now, sitting beneath the pale light of a screen, they faced the possibility that their first honest message might arrive after your heart had already learned how to live without it. Still, they began typing again. This time, they did not try to create the perfect opening. They wrote what was true. I am sorry. They paused. Then continued. I saw your name today, and I realized I have spent a long time pretending that losing you did not change me. Their hand trembled. I told myself you would come back because you always cared enough to come back. I never asked what it cost you. They stopped to breathe. The friend quietly left the room, giving them privacy. Rain began again, soft against the glass. They continued. You tried to reach me when I was hiding from myself. You asked for honesty, and I gave you confusion. You gave me chances I did not recognize as chances because I thought your love would keep them available forever. The message grew longer. Not manipulative. Not asking you to return. For once, they were not writing to control the result. They were writing because the truth had finally become heavier than fear. They confessed that they cared. They confessed that the closeness had frightened them. They confessed that your love exposed their wounds, and instead of healing them, they blamed the connection for making them visible. They admitted that every time they withdrew, part of them hoped you would follow, because being pursued made them feel safe without requiring them to become vulnerable. They admitted that when you stopped chasing, they called it rejection rather than recognizing it as exhaustion. The words came slowly, then rapidly. Years of emotional avoidance pressed into sentences. But one truth remained unwritten. The central truth. The one that connected to the moment they first began pulling away. There had been a reason. Not an excuse. A reason. Something had happened inside them when the connection became real enough to change their future. A memory had been triggered. A fear had awakened. A choice had been made in silence. You had felt the result without ever knowing the cause. They placed their fingers over the screen. They knew that if they included this truth, the message would no longer be a simple apology. It would become the confession you had once waited to hear. The confession that could explain the mixed signals, the sudden distance, the nights they almost called, the moments they watched you leave without stopping you. Their heart raced. They looked at your name at the top of the screen. You were more than a contact now. You were the person who had known something was hidden, even when they denied it. They whispered, "I should have told you." The room held the words. Then they typed the beginning of the secret. The reason I pulled away was not because I stopped loving you. They stared at the sentence. For a moment, they could not continue. Because the next line would reveal what they had protected more fiercely than the relationship itself. They thought of deleting everything. They imagined closing the phone and returning to silence. But your final message echoed in their mind, that you hoped they would one day find the courage to face what they were running from. This was that moment. Not a magical guarantee. Not a promise of reunion. A moment of accountability. They took a breath and began writing again. The truth is, the night everything changed, I received something that made me believe being close to you would eventually destroy the one thing I was most afraid to lose. They stopped. The sentence looked incomplete because it was incomplete. What had they received? A warning? A message? A memory from the past? Words from someone they trusted? The answer had shaped every silence that followed. They had allowed it to stand between you without giving you the dignity of knowing it existed. Now they were ready to name it. But before they could write the next line, a new notification appeared beneath your name. Their face went pale. It was not a message from you. It was something connected to you, something they had not expected to see, something that made them realize the apology they were writing might truly have arrived after the life they once imagined with you had already moved beyond their reach. Their tears returned. Not because the notification was cruel. Because it revealed that while they had been gathering courage, you had been making a decision of your own. And when they opened it, they finally discovered what your last silence had actually meant.